Here we are, our very first Global Cyber Policy Radar podcast recording. I reckon we should introduce ourselves before we start. Hello, world. My name is Kat Sommer. I look after government affairs and analyst relations for NCC Group.
And I am Verona, or Johnstone-Hulse, and I have the absolute pleasure of working with both Kat and Seena within the government affairs team at NCC.
Yep, hiya, and I'm Seena Williams. Echoing, I also work within the government affairs team at NCC Group, and yeah, happy to be here today.
It's fun, isn't it? Because we spend a lot of time, Seena, who I'm here with, thinking about and brainstorming the trends that we've seen in terms of where governments are going and regulating cybersecurity, passing legislation, talking about passing legislation, and then we put it on a big sheet of paper and a whiteboard and drew lots of arrows and made sense of it, and then you two authored the report. So we've been living and breathing this for the last couple of months. But for people who are new to this and who've never seen the radar before, heard about what it is, how would you describe it, really?
Well, you're absolutely right, Kat, and I think that when we're doing the brainstorming, it's because we want to make this report more than just a list of cyber regulations that are coming up, and ensuring that we're putting together something that really understands not only the different compliance deadlines that organisations might be facing in the next few months, but also looking far beyond on the horizon in terms of what governments are doing, what agendas they're setting, and how that might impact organisations in 6, 12, 18 months to 5 years. So really what this report is an assessment of the entire political landscape and how that translates into cyber policies that governments are setting, and then how that then translates into organisations' actions that they need to take off the back of that. So really it's supposed to be a guide to more than just your kind of immediate compliance obligations, but what are the big themes that you need to be aware of that are going to affect the way in which you have to put together your cybersecurity programs, the way in which you manage your data, manage your technology suppliers, thinking about what are those trends that we're seeing now that are going to translate into things that are going to require action further down the line.
And I think that the bit that's kind of most fun for me in that process is, obviously we're all policy geeks at heart, so we do get really excited about the policy shifts and the understanding the government's intent in putting forward a proposal or whatever. But I think what makes the work that we do behind the scenes on this really fun is that you then have to translate it to what it means for organizations operating in this environment. And you get a little bit of both, because you get the really geekily excited, oh my God, they're really doing this from a government point of view, and then do the so what, now what kind of translation to say to someone who has, I don't know how many competing priorities, of which regulatory awareness and compliance is one. This is why it matters to you, and this is why you need to care about it, which is nice, and it brings us great joy overall, I think.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons, isn't it, Cal, that we try and bring in different parts of the organization. So like you said, we have this like initial brainstorm where we're going, oh, these are the exciting geeky policy trends that we're seeing at the moment, and then we take that around our various colleagues at NCC Group to assess whether this is something that's playing out in the work that they're doing with organizations across the economy, and what are the kind of key things and implications that are likely to come to fruition as a result of some of this stuff, rather than, as you say, staying in our nice little policy geekery bubble.
Yeah, and we'll go on to talk about the themes for this edition, which is our 5th edition. So we have been doing that for the last 2 years, and I think it's also been really interesting just watching the evolution of how cyber is being treated by governments and what that means for organizations. And I think there's a consistency in some ways, and in terms of the kind of more incremental changes that we're seeing, and some stuff owing to largely geopolitical pressures and developments, just sort of almost at the flick of a switch, is different from the last 6 months to the next 6 months, which has been quite fun. But we were in a little room in our office, and we were doing the brainstorming and kind of pulling all of this together. What did you find most surprising when we were looking at the themes, where as we were discussing it and kind of pooling our brains, sounds really weird, pooling our brains and our brain power together and sort of bouncing off each other? Was there anything where you went, I did not expect to come to this conclusion as part of this process?
I wonder, Seena, because this is your kind of first foray into the radar, I'll be really interested to hear what you've got to say on this, and kind of coming into the process. But from my perspective, I think it's that realization that, and it's something that we've explored in previous editions, but it really is kind of coming to fruition now, and we're seeing the real implications of it in terms of the way in which the world has changed, and we're not going back to this golden era of globalization anytime soon. So for the future of cyber rules, regulations, while there are some really worthy efforts to try and harmonize some of this stuff, actually organizations are going to continue to have to navigate in a particularly kind of fragmented, regionally focused policy and regulatory landscape. So, I mean, it's not like a massive surprise, but it really kind of hammered home, and you can see it across all of the different areas that we are exploring in this edition of the radar, the way in which that geopolitical landscape, this era of mistrust, this era of lacking clarity about who's allied to whom, is really translating, is not only translating in terms of the threat landscape and, obviously organizations having to navigate what that means for cyber threats, but it is now tangibly resulting in governments taking action across different areas of cyber policy, regulation and law, which have direct impacts on the way in which organizations have to put together their cybersecurity programs.
Yeah, I'd agree. Just jumping on Rose's point, the kind of cyber moving from this more kind of neutral commercial domain to this kind of area of strategic competition, and especially in the current geopolitical climate we're living in, it being and we'll touch on kind of offensive cyber later, how it's kind of actively being used in these disruption campaigns, these if we say wartime effort campaigns, quote unquote, and how that kind of brings in the kind of public-private relationship, and the relationship that private organizations are having to consider with their respective governments, and whether they want to enable certain operations or not, and kind of that tricky spot they're put in. So I'd say less so surprised, but more just like the stark realization of cyber is like an active part of the war front now, and it's kind of like where do we go from here, and how do we do that balance?
Yeah, I would completely echo that, and it's so interesting, isn't it? Because when we were in the big 2024 election year, when we were kind of putting together our report on state of the nation in terms of cyber policy, and I think one of the key lines was cyber is apolitical, and we were looking at it from a party political point of view at that point, but still overall I think it was very much seen, as you say, as a technical, neutral, kind of factual issue, and the politicization or geopoliticization of cybersecurity and cyber resilience and cyber campaigns in its various guises that we've seen over the last year or so has been quite stark. And it's, in a way, it's fun because, you know, again, us policy geeks or other people working in the field all of a sudden are kind of like slightly drawn into the spotlight, and everyone seemingly cares about cyber, and that's nice in some way. And kind of on the other hand, you now have people interested in cyber and getting involved and kind of putting down expectations and dictating outcomes and interfering with how organizations do cyber, or how they want, governments want organizations to be involved in cyber, which kind of, you could turn back time and go, can we just go back to the neutral bit? I wonder whether some people might feel that was a better state of being. Shall we talk about sovereignty? Because I love talking about sovereignty, as you know. I mean, I have been obsessed with this theme for the last year or so, and that has been, I think, one of the kind of clearest visible outcomes of this era of mistrust and politicization, geopoliticization of things. And I think what I found incredibly helpful as we were going through the drafting of the radar was the contextualization of the different facets that the word sovereignty can take when governments look at what they are actually trying to achieve, and then look at the different means by which they are achieving their intended outcome. And we've got this really quite nice flowchart diagram in the radar to try and explain it. But I think our overall conclusion is very much don't buy into the sovereignty hype, where people are talking about sovereignty really break down what it is that they're trying to do. And if you listen to people, ultimately it's an exercise in risk management. But shall we unpick that a little bit more?
Yeah, and it's really interesting, isn't it? Because there's some parts of sovereignty, so like say data sovereignty, that's been around for donkey's years, and where there has been efforts to ensure that data stays within respective jurisdictions for quite a while now. But as you say, Kat, in the last year or so, we've really seen governments around the world ramping up in terms of their sovereignty agendas. The challenge is that sovereignty means very different things depending on the context, depending on where you are in the world. And there isn't this kind of one clear definition of what digital sovereignty really means, or a one size fits all approach to how you then manage it. So for organizations that are looking at this, it's really important to just not to go, oh, you know, this government's looking at digital sovereignty and immediately assume it's one thing or another. It's really important to break down in terms of what are the motivations of that government, what are they trying to achieve. And generally it's around ensuring that there are restrictions on who makes, owns, controls, or has access to one of four things. So it's data that we've seen for a while, cloud and digital infrastructure, critical technology, so things like AI, quantum, and then also the supply chains that underpin all of those things, but also underpin various bits of critical national infrastructure. So really understanding what it is that governments are trying to achieve, and then also looking at, okay, how are they then translating that into practical policy and regulatory outcomes? And obviously one of the things that we look at in the radar is there are kind of two key areas where governments are looking at bits of intervention. One is around placing restrictions on the nationality of the providers that you might have to use, or the suppliers you might have to use. So big thing in that area really is the EU's Cybersecurity Act reviews, looking at restricting certain parts of critical infrastructure and government bodies from using third-party ICT providers from what they deem to be high-risk countries. TBC what high-risk countries mean, which is part of the problem with this debate, because a lot of the definitions are still evolving and moving quite quickly. Similarly, we've seen Australia in the last few weeks announce similar plans to restrict critical infrastructure, so those organisations regulated under the SOCI Act, to restrict their use of high-risk ICT providers. And we've seen a similar debate kind of playing out both in the UK and the US as well. So, you know, as part of the kind of cybersecurity regulatory infrastructure, these limitations on the suppliers that you're able to use, and sometimes that might be tied to kind of where they're headquartered or where they're owned and controlled from, but that's really starting to come into play. And then the second area that we're seeing an impact on is the extent to which governments are trying to introduce new rules that essentially enable either countries or nation states or critical organizations to ensure that the way in which they're accessing data or technology is done so securely. So that's things like evolving supply chain rules, things like SPOM coming in. It's things like data localization and really kind of ramping up of those sorts of rules, particularly in the kind of context of the current geopolitical landscape. It's looking at products, so the extent to which the digital products that we all rely on across the economy are secure. And it's also looking at extending what are traditionally kind of critical national infrastructure rules to suppliers or things like managed service providers, to make sure that there's a kind of an uplift across the economy. So really the kind of main message for organizations within the kind of context of this theme is you need to understand what it is that governments are trying to achieve across the different jurisdictions that you operate, and then really understand how that's translating into kind of practical policy and regulatory outcomes, so that you can kind of build that into your global framework, rather than assuming it's one thing or another, because it will probably mean very different things depending on whether you're in the Netherlands or the US or Singapore.
Yeah, and it is I think one of the key areas where as we've said, this is the politicization of cyber security really comes to the fore, because the underlying motivations or the underlying rationales might be, I do not trust this particular country, or I consider this particular country to be an adversary, so therefore I don't trust the technology that comes out of that country. That has a very, very geopolitical kind of ring to it. There might be an element of almost industrial policy and competitiveness and growth kind of rationale to go, oh, but if we don't trust this country, maybe we encourage organizations to take up our local providers, which, you know, in turn promotes growth of the local economy, which is a very kind of different motivation or different rationale for a government to think about. But the overarching theme of, but what we're really doing is doing this in the interest of national/cybersecurity, and you almost have this layer of, but it's for cybersecurity reasons, even though the underlying motivations might be very different, which is why, I mean, I think it's the hill that we will all die on, that actually having people like ourselves to go, no, understand the motivations of government, because that gives you so much insight into what the actual outcome is that they're trying to achieve, and helps you understand the means by which they're trying to achieve that, which then in turn, if you're having to comply with that, will inform how you do that in the best possible way. And you just have a much more intelligent approach to how you set up your cyber resilience programs if you really understand the full context in which that needs to happen.
Yeah, totally. And I think there's it comes back to that point around a lot of these policy agendas are evolving really quickly, and definitions are changing, shifting. organizations are being asked to comply with something in, say, a year's time, but without a kind of defined framework underpinning it. And so if you understand the motivations behind what they're trying to achieve, you can make an educated guess as to what it is that governments are going to require at the end of the road before having to wait for regulatory guidance to be published, or, you know, a framework to be put together. So yeah, it's really important that you do understand that broader landscape, understand the motivations, because that will help inform early action that puts you in a good place, rather than kind of panicking when things are published and then governments maybe expect organizations to comply within quite tight deadlines often.
Yeah, which actually is a nice segue to move on to AI and regulation of AI in terms of waiting for guidance, potential delays, rushing with implementation deadlines. I think we all remember the golden days of golden age of global collaboration, where we were all hoping that there might be globally accepted AI governance framework that would set the guardrails for the development of AI technologies and AI use cases, so that we maybe avoid the mistakes of the social media age, where things were running rampant before someone went, oh, there's some harm associated with that, isn't there? So maybe we should do something about that. Well, going back to the age of global mistrust and geopolitical kerfuffle, is that a polite enough word? AI and the attempt of having a globally accepted AI governance framework, or an all-encompassing AI law, I think overall governments around the world have accepted defeat, or have pivoted their approach, haven't they? I think it's fair to say that. I mean, South Korea, I think, published an encompassing AI law, but other than South Korea and the European Union, this promise of there will be a range of harmonized, comprehensive AI legislations hasn't really materialized, has it? But instead, we are seeing what, Seena?
Yeah, so you're right. The appetite around those kind of sweeping AI laws has cooled in quite a lot of jurisdictions, and we're seeing kind of this pivot towards more regulation of AI being enforced through existing frameworks and like compliance structures. So I think, well, it's multi-pronged, isn't it? So like when I back in the old days, when I was kind of doing research on AI and like AI regulation, one of the things, the kind of common talking points was, you know, the speed of innovation is too fast for regulation to keep up with. And so, you know, having a big sweeping law, like, it won't work, because by the time it gets passed, because, you know, things in the EU take 500 years to become law. Yep. You know, it's going to be outdated, etc. That's not me. That's what I've read. Obviously, that can be a bit of a cop out, but there is a point in that an issue in kind of trying to put forward these big laws is sometimes flexibility and adaptivity. So unless you kind of allow for certain provisions that make it easier to add amendments or tweak things accordingly, some kind of view these laws as a bit burdensome. And there's also the point of, you know, innovation. You know, lots of countries are focused on, you know, economic growth, and AI is kind of seen as one of those key pillars of economic growth. And so we don't want to stifle innovation of the AI sector by having these big burdensome laws. However, there are, of course, real risks and potential harms that come with widespread adoption of AI. And so we're seeing, for example, in like the UK, they're using the I think cyber assessment framework, cyber CAF. I always get these acronyms confused, but using that as a means of regulating AI. We've seen some movement in the past year around specifically AI chatbots, which can you know, perpetuate online harms, you know, child pornographic material, etc., deepfakes. In the EU, they're still kind of going ahead with their big bill, but they are delaying certain provisions around high-risk systems. And part of that is, implementation, enforcement, the kind of nitty-gritty, how it's actually going to work in practice, and kind of ironing out those details. In the US, we're also kind of seeing a different approach whereby, there's a bit of a, as often with the US, a bit of tension between what's going on the state level and what's going on the federal level. Some of the rhetoric we've seen from the Trump White House is, we don't want this kind of patchwork of state legislation to kind of make things burdensome for businesses, confuse things, and we need kind of federal preemption in that space. But in the absence of having an existing federal law, a lot of states have kind of gone ahead and passed their own laws because, there are real concerns and harms there, and especially, error of deepfakes and misinformation. There are, very valid reasons for that. But yes, in saying all of that, states are being adaptable. They're saying, like, maybe not have, this big all-encompassing bill, but let's find ways we can, regulate aspects of AI and be more, I guess, specific and strategic. And so I guess for businesses, it's less about waiting for this kind of big act, unless, of course, we're talking about the EU, but thinking about your wider profile, AI profile, the specific elements and where they sit, and where specific regulations will call for you to have certain safeguards in those respects. So, it is in some elements sometimes easier to have kind of a one-stop shop of, okay, this is the big law, we have to follow everything in this big law. But yeah, in this case, it's about kind of pivoting and just being aware of the full picture and kind of, sorting yourself out in accordance with that, which can be challenging, but keeps you on your toes.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there is a case to be made for that approach in saying ultimately AI isn't just one specific technology; it's a pretty horizontal thing, I guess. So actually, not having an all-encompassing bill that might overlap with stuff that's already there, but taking that more case-by-case approach or more sectoral approach and looking at governing or regulating AI through the lens of existing regulation might be more efficient or more effective and potentially easier for organizations to get their head around, because they're not layering another thing on top of what they're already doing, even if it, as you say, it requires a slight pivot in people's minds, because for a couple of months we were promised one big AI bill, and that, I think people were in this wait and see approach, and kind of going back on that, I think might cause some headaches for organizations. But I think overall, this current approach might be the more sensible one. Not that we're necessarily judging.
Yeah, and I think there's an element of, it's just organizations being aware of that integration of AI into existing frameworks, because it's very easy to read the headlines of, like, the UK, Australia abandons their plans for an AI Act, or that you were saying, Seena, the federal government in the US putting out its communications about AI and potentially some pushing more of a kind of deregulatory approach. It's easy to read those headlines and think, okay, fine, so we're not going to face any AI regulation. But kind of, as you said, it is happening. It's just happening in a more nuanced sector by sector basis and being integrated into existing cybersecurity frameworks.
Yeah. The third theme that we're exploring in this edition of the Radar is around board accountability and the fact that government and regulators are even more squarely now placing responsibility for cyber resilience on boards and senior management. And I'm always struck by, like, we're all based in the UK, right? So we do interact with UK government stakeholders quite quite regularly as part of our jobs, but I'm always struck by how much they talk about actually needing to reach in their communications and their engagement the boards and the chief executives of the big businesses that kind of make up a core part of the UK economy. And sometimes it's a little bit offensive because they go, we speak to the cyber industry all the time. They get why this matters. They get why this is important. The people we need to speak to are the people in manufacturing businesses and energy businesses, and really kind of focusing on this top-down engagement, because we all know culture is set from the top, so the boards get cyber resilience. I think that the expectation is that it'll just trickle down, and organizations, and by virtue of that, the economy as a whole, will become more cyber resilient. Do we think, or have we seen evidence of that approach actually shifting boards' behaviors as yet?
I think it's too early to say. So I mean, it's like, the irony is that I feel like we as an ecosystem within the cyber world have been talking about the need for cyber risk to be a board level conversation and owned at that level for a while, and it feels like, particularly in the last 12 months, that governments have realized this too, and so there has been this kind of shift in terms of governments looking at what are the different tools available to them to try and get boards to act. A lot of that stuff hasn't quite come into fruition yet, but I feel like the next 6 to 12 months will be really critical in seeing how effective some of those mechanisms are. So looking at the one hand, the kind of more voluntary end of the spectrum. So governments really shifting their rhetoric. You had the UK Chancellor writing to FTSE 350 CEOs. You had President Trump in his national cyber strategy talking about board level responsibility. So using some of their governments using some of their more rhetoric-based power to encourage forcefully boards to take on a level of accountability and responsibility. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have the more regulatory intervention approach. So that includes things like reporting on cyber risks as part of kind of formal annual reporting processes. There's things like the SEC rules in the US, but also things like DORA and NIS2 in the European Union, which does place specific liability on senior leaders to make sure that they are in compliance. And we've even just seen kind of Israel come out with a draft cyber law that goes even further than civil liability and looks potentially at things like criminal liability for senior leaders. So a lot of these laws, so things like NIS2, DORA, we'll hopefully start seeing some of the effects of that this year. Other governments are still trying to work out their approaches. Say in the UK, there's a lot of talk about this at the moment, and there is more of a focus at the moment on voluntary approach, but whether that evolves into something a bit more stick rather than carrot over the next few months is to be seen. So in terms of your original question, Kat, which I think was about whether actually we are seeing this change
making a difference. Yeah,
it's too, I think it's too early because the policies are almost kind of just being set, but I do think that the next 6 months are going to be really critical in seeing whether that does shift behavior at that senior level, and whether we can tie it explicitly back to the stuff that governments are doing as well, because there is a broader landscape, isn't there, of boards realizing that cybersecurity is a really important aspect of their job and a risk that they need to manage. So it's trying to distinguish what's being driven by governments, what's being driven by boards going, oh shit, this is really important part of us having an effective business.
And I think what I find really interesting about that, because I think we're seeing a potentially parallel development in our world, where all of a sudden, because geopolitics is what it is at the moment, people leading businesses are going, so or the politics and the how that shapes our operating environment actually matters, because it impacts us. And they come to their government affairs policy people internally and go, just tell me what you're doing around all this. All of a sudden, like, stuff we've been doing for ages in the background becomes front of mind for kind of senior management and boards. And I do think that parallel development is happening in cyber resilience. And I think part of the conversations we've been having with, CISOs following the Chancellor's letter to the FTSE 350 companies that you reference is that some of them anyways, found that quite a helpful catalyst, because all of a sudden boards were going to the CISOs and going, the Chancellor just sent me this letter about cyber. Can you just tell me what we're doing? And the CISOs who were prepared were sort of going, oh, why, yes, look at all this. Oh, and by the way, if we want to do even more, here's my budget request. And we're using and leveraging it in a very meaningful way. But I think one of the kind of lessons or the pieces of advice, or what you want to call it, that we put in the radar is that actually, if you are in charge of the cybersecurity program for your organization, being aware of this trend and being prepared for, upstairs to come knocking and go, what are we doing? And knowing how to sell everything that you're investing in and that you're improving in terms of your cyber resilience in a business ready language is a really important thing, because that means you can then take full advantage of the potential upside of greater government interest in board accountability for cyber.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's that kind of two-pronged approach. So it's be prepared for boards to have more scrutiny over what you're doing, because, when Chancellor writes to you, you kind of stand up and take notice. But also on the flip side, you need to use it. Use it to your advantage to make those business cases internally.
Yeah. Greater kind of government interest in cyber and working with business is also one of the themes that kind of carries over into greater use of offensive cyber capabilities. And I think, going back to my original question of what really surprised us as we were putting this together, we talked about that theme and that trend, I think, in the previous edition, but it's become even more visible. I think that for a long time, whenever governments or regulators or people in charge of political decision making talked about cybersecurity, it was very focused on the defensive side of things. So it was, what do we need to do to make sure that organizations are able to withstand or are protected against cyber attacks, so that cyber attacks are no longer successful. With the, going back to it, geopoliticization of cybersecurity, I think there is this shift in government's thinking to say, no, we need to increase cost on our adversaries. We need to deter cyber, not just protect against cyber attacks, but deter cyber attacks from happening in the first place. And the kind of common go-to tool in the toolbox is we need to build up our offensive cyber capabilities, or call it cyber weapons, call it the cyber arsenal, however you want to do it. And you know that the UK has been relatively open about it in terms of its national cyber force, and it has published responsible cyber force in practice, which is the kind of the doctrine that sets out how to use those capabilities responsibly, which I think is a really important element of this whole debate. But Seena, I wonder whether you just give us the rundown of the latest developments we have seen in that space.
Yeah, so as you said, cyber kind of moving from this kind of defensive to the more proactive, and we see language, particularly with the US cyber strategy around disrupting adversary behavior, imposing costs on them, essentially hitting them before they can hit us, or making it harder for them to do so by using cyber. Yeah, I mean, we've seen it used more recently in operations in Venezuela, in Iran, cyber kind of being a tool of these operations. France equally have, spoken about kind of mobilizing judicial, technical, diplomatic, military, economic levers, etc., to deter attacks. The Dutch have had commitments to expand defensive and offensive cyber capabilities. Denmark also, they're recruiting hackers for offensive cyber operations. Likewise, Ireland also kind of trying to expand those kind of powers. So you're kind of seeing these states pulling private sector actors kind of into this because most of these cyber what's the word capabilities, etc., are in the hands of the private sector. So the question then moves to, leaders in these cyber organizations as to what do you do if, your government comes to you and says, we need you to, disrupt this power line, this communication line, etc. And it's a pressing question. And, in these, as we keep the hot word is geopolitical climate, the phrase of the day in this current, geopolitical climate, it is it's a very real prospect and something boards and senior leaders need to think about. And yeah, and in that there will be kind of higher expectations around, information sharing, resilience, and kind of alignment with national priorities. I think quite an interesting point there is, if you're a multinational organization working across different jurisdictions, what does that actually mean in practice? I might throw that to you guys actually.
Which nation state do you align with if the nation state's interests are in conflict? And I think you mentioned information sharing on the spectrum of private sector being asked to support cyber operations or cyber resilience activities. That is probably the least difficult one because we share threat intelligence or vulnerability intelligence with the right authorities to improve the general awareness, situational awareness, resilience posture. The tricky bit, and you mentioned that as well, that comes in is if a government comes knocking and goes, yep, that thing you control, just go disrupt that infrastructure for a little bit so we can carry out whatever other operation we have in mind at the moment. And I think there'll be levels of intelligence that can and can't be shared, which might complicate that matter further. But I do wonder whether, because we say, organizations should be prepared and think through how they would respond to such a request. What will be the biggest challenges? Is it legal considerations? Is it ethical considerations? Is it operational considerations? Because our position, I think, has always been anything that is disruptive cyber activity should be the prerogative of the state because they operate under the right legal authority and the right level of supervision and democratic oversight. Throw the private sector into the mix, and that becomes a really quite complex picture to unpick, right?
Proportionality, escalation thresholds, legal authority, all of them is still, we don't have clear vision of what that is, which can make things a bit messy potentially,
Yeah, totally agree with that. Like that approach is relatively straightforward if there is amongst kind of allied countries a universally agreed ethical framework, but there isn't, and so that makes it quite tricky, and especially in an era when allied countries are changing and who were friends before are maybe now frenemies or foes, and so what kind of ethical framework that you adhere to, it's a really tricky question to answer. There will obviously be different legal frameworks depending on where you are in the world, but in terms of, to your point, like the proportionality, the different aspects that are needed within an ethical framework, there isn't this universally agreed approach to how does a global organization navigate that. It's a tricky question to answer, but it is something that organizations should be asking themselves and thinking through properly, because it is a realistic prospect that they might be asked to get involved in this sort of activity.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the key advice, or the key line, is that you can't answer that question for someone else. But the really important thing is for us anyway, is to encourage organizations to have that conversation internally and bring together the different internal stakeholders that have views and different perspectives, so that they are prepared, or better prepared, to respond and answer if the situation arises where a government stakeholder asks them to do a specific thing. And at that point, I guess the last thing you want to do is flap around widely and go, well, what do we do? Whereas if you'd had the preparatory conversation before, and you have, I guess, maybe some principles for how a decision will be taken, or at least a list of the internal stakeholders that do need to be consulted, or the perspectives that need to be taken into account, or the different kind of layers, whether it's operational, whether it's ethical, whether it's legal, that you need to find answers to, that will make it easier to respond in that situation, hopefully result in a better informed and a more well structured and well founded decision. Because the potential implications of being drawn into or participating in an offensive cyber campaign, again, pretty untested, I think, so will have to be considered very carefully. But yeah, we also saved our most favorite topic to last, didn't we? Because as people might or might not know, we've been long-standing supporters of and campaigners for reform of the UK's Computer Misuse Act, and more broadly around legal protections for cybersecurity researchers, because what we've found is that a lot of the legal frameworks governing cybercrime ultimately were drafted in an era when the cybersecurity industry, as we know it today, didn't really exist. So almost by default, a lot of the dual use work that can be done either by cyber criminals or by cybersecurity professionals means that a lot of good cybersecurity research, whether that's vulnerability research or threat intelligence research, ends up being criminalized by the current legal frameworks, which is bad. However, the positive developments in recent months, and therefore which have informed the question that we're asking, is that we have seen a number of countries recognize that the way in which they are articulating new cyber regulations does require a review of the old frameworks. And Ro will explain in a little bit more detail what that actually looks like.
Sure. So yes, as you say, very exciting times, because we are seeing progress in an area that we have been campaigning what feels like for several decades on. But there's a kind of an interesting link between the progress that we've seen towards governments implementing reform to their legal frameworks to provide those legal protections for cybersecurity professionals, and actually realizing that they can't necessarily implement some of the core cyber regulations and cyber obligations that they're putting on organizations without doing this kind of legal reform. So the most obvious example of that is in the European Union, where both within the NIS2 directive and the Cyber Resilience Act, there are provisions in there essentially saying to member states that you need to make sure that your legal frameworks for vulnerability research are up to date to enable compliance with the various different obligations related to vulnerability disclosure can be fulfilled by organizations, because you can't, have effective vulnerability disclosure policies or bug bounty programs without the researchers participating and finding said vulnerabilities. Equally, you can't have the effective kind of cyber resilience programs without good threat intelligence research. So making sure that you have the right protections in place on that side too. So off the kind of back of that, the NIS2 directive and Cyber Resilience Act, we've seen different member states take action. So for example, most recently, Portugal, as part of its kind of transposition of the NIS2 directive into domestic national law, included provisions for legal protections for vulnerability researchers. So that was a really positive step. Equally, we are seeing kind of movement outside of Europe, so outside of the European Union. So in the UK, for example, there has been discussion within the UK Parliament around whether the obligations that are being strengthened under the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill for critical national infrastructure organisations, whether they can be fulfilled without updating the Computer Misuse Act. And so there has been kind of ongoing debate and discussion about whether some kind of amendment or some kind of separate strand of activity is needed to make sure that piece of legislation is updated. And very recently, very excitingly, we had the Security Minister committing to putting in place some kind of statutory defence for researchers in that space. So yeah, it's a really nice, almost a very nice positive story to end on in a discussion that was very much focused on mistrust and geopolitical landscape causing all sorts of confusion for organisations. But yeah, we are seeing good progress towards making sure that cybersecurity professionals have the legal protections they need, and this is partly being driven by the regulatory frameworks that the governments are putting in place and the obligations that they're expecting organisations to fulfil, and therefore needing the people to be able to fulfil them.
Yeah, which is as you say, is a very nice note to end on, not least because it's also a nod towards regulatory coherence in a way, and bringing together the different elements of the cyber policy ecosystems. You've got the resilience side and the crime side and all that, and the recognition that you can't have counterintuitive provisions on the different sides of the policy ecosystem, and that needs resolving is a positive note to end on, and ending we shall. But before we do, obviously we are about 2 weeks out from Cyber UK, which is the UK National Cybersecurity Centre's big flagship annual conference. She'll be in Glasgow this year. I'm really excited. I'm going to be, my usual Duracell bunny Tigger on speed self, jumping about the conference, hoping to see the good and the great of the cyber ecosystem. But for anyone and everyone listening, as we've said, it's all a bit daunting. It's all a bit the world's on fire thing, and cyber is right bang in the middle of that. What's the key takeaway for either of you, that people shutting down the podcast app in a second, rather than putting their heads in their hands in despair, what will bring them this ray of hope that will allow them to bounce around Cyber UK like Tigger too?
Well, on my end, I'd just probably say, I mean, there are realities that we're living in and we can't avoid it, but in as much as we can control the controllables, I'll use a phrase my mum uses, fail to prepare to fail. So know what you've got, know your infrastructure, know your data, know your cloud management, understand the risk profile, understand the different requirements you may need to face, plan accordingly. As Kat mentioned earlier, speak to the correct people, the correct stakeholders internally and just make sure everyone's aligned and you've got things in place. And, you know, on the wider kind of geopolitical questions, again, same thing. You can't predict what's going to happen, but just try and have as many ducks in a row as you can, you know, have those conversations, those, you know, tough conversations sometimes, but have those procedures in place and, you know that if and when, you know, something may happen, that you've kind of got an established protocol and at least an idea of what you're going to do. And I think that's as best as you can do in this current world we're living in.
Yeah, no, I love that the summary is listen to Seena's mum.
Never wrong. Never wrong.
The only thing I'd build on that and say, kind of within that process of preparation, ensuring that you are talking to your policy or public affairs people that understand that broader geopolitical, political policy landscape and can help you predict as far as possible or horizon scan as far as possible in terms of what governments are doing and what their motivations are, because that will help you with that preparation or early preparation. And obviously, if you don't have said colleagues, or even if you do, use our Global Cyber Policy Radar report as your navigation tool for a lot of these questions, because, you know, this is something that we put a lot of thought and effort into, and is something that we publish every 6 months or so, and hopefully in absence of any kind of internal advice will help you to understand what are some of the key questions that you need to be thinking about when you're looking at your preparatory work.
Yeah, that's a perfect note to end on. And I think it's everything we talked about today, the resources that are there, I think ultimately will help us all revel in the fact that cyber is increasingly taking center stage and allow us to make the most of it and use it for the better, and hopefully deliver outcomes for the public good now and in the future. But we shall release all of you into the wild after this. Seena, thank you very much. This was fun. We should do it again in 6 months' time.
100%.
Cool.
Thanks, Kat.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.